I want to tell Jesse's story because it's really God's story. Jesse Josiah means gift, the Lord is healed. And by the grace of God, that's what he is. You would never know that the boy you see today once looked like this. At Jesse's anatomy scan at my 20-week ultrasound, the tech noticed a slight tilt in his heart. She sent me for further testing. It was just the cardiologist and I in the room when she came in and gave me the results from his echocardiogram. She said he had a very rare congenital heart defect. She wasn't certain whether or not he would make it through the pregnancy, and if he did, what quality of life he would have. In an effort to educate myself as much as possible, I read as many scientific studies as I could find. I read scary words like life expectancy, quality of life, morbidity, and mortality. One study I came across said he had a 20% survival rate. And the reason is with his specific diagnosis, it's not just the heart that's affected, but the enlarged pulmonary arteries restrict proper airway and lung growth. There's quite a spectrum with this diagnosis, and Jesse was on the severe side because his pulmonary arteries measured larger than the cardiologist had ever seen. I found a support group on Facebook of different parents with children with the same diagnosis, and seeing all the pictures of the babies in hospital beds connected to machines and children on continual breathing support. I really didn't know if I would be able to do it. It was quite a process of grief. I felt myself stiffen up. I questioned God's providence and his plan, and I recoiled in fear. But I eventually settled in a place of humble faith. Not faith that it would be easy, but even when it wasn't, faith that God was still on his throne. We were referred to Texas Children's Hospital for further testing. I was hoping that perhaps they had made some type of mistake and we would get better news. But actually the opposite happened. He was already showing signs of heart failure, and they prepared me that he would probably have DeGeorge syndrome, and from measurements of his bones, they also thought he had Down syndrome. They gave us such little hope at that appointment that I actually came home and called several funeral homes trying to get an idea of the process of bearing a child. The doctor told me that Jesse was okay as long as he was in my womb, but the moment he was born, his lungs would have to start working on their own, and he would be fighting to survive. Seeing all the pictures of babies lying in beds, cut and poked and connected to equipment keeping them alive, I really questioned what God's will was. Were all these medical advancements a blessing or a curse? You're keeping someone alive, but they're suffering. It took several weeks of prayer and counsel for me to come to the conclusion that I would fight for Jesse's life, just like I would fight for the life of any of my children. And I would use the best medical advancements available and leave the number of Jesse's days in God's hands. And that's what we did. We moved to Texas Children's Hospital because they were #1 in pediatric cardiology. They wanted me close to the hospital prior to delivery, so when I was 8 months pregnant, I moved to Texas with my then 4-year-old and 2-year-old. It would be 5 months before we would get to return home as a family. Tim traveled there to visit on the weekends, but he had to come home and work during the week. So Jesse's birth story is a story of God's power in itself. Several months before Jesse was born, the Lord gave me a dream on what day he would be born. I woke up and I marked the calendar October 2nd. I held on to that because there were so many unknowns. It felt like one known thing that could ground me. And sure enough, October 2nd, I woke up in labor at 2 a.m. in the morning. It could not have been better timing. Tim was able to make the 4.5-hour drive there with no traffic. And 15 minutes after he walked into the hospital room, labor quickly progressed. They thought we would never get to hold Jesse, but I actually got to hold him twice. After that, he had crashed, and they took him to a wing on the other side of the hospital, and it would be several hours before we would get to see him again. And when we got to see him, he was connected to all types of equipment and on a ton of medicine to keep his heart beating. The doctor set me down and said that we had a very sick baby, and they could not tell me whether or not we would get to take him home. That first night in the hospital was really difficult. My womb was empty, but so were my arms. And I could hear all the babies around crying. And I was apart from my other two children for the first time in their lives. It goes against every natural instinct of a mother to leave her newborn. Everything in you wants to hold them and protect them and nurture them. I feared the thought of him lying there feeling alone, possibly in pain, scared by all the sounds, and I couldn't go to him. I couldn't hold him. Preparing for his birth, I purchased something called Zaki gloves. They are weighted gloves that's supposed to be the same weight of a mother's forearm, and they are able to hold your scent. So several weeks prior to the birth, I would sleep with them, and I gave them to the nurses, asking that they would please place them on him so he would not feel alone. And I also got a recorder, and on that recorder I recorded myself praying for him and singing to him, and asked the nurses to play it as often as possible. They ended up calling it the mommy box. I had head to toe hives for several months. I was, just from the stress of it all, I felt forcefully pulled from my other children. I constantly had the feeling that I was in the wrong place. I was always trying to balance the question of where was I needed the most and for how long. Before Jesse's open heart surgery, he had a rapid respiratory rate. And because it took so much effort to breathe, his sides tugged in sharply with each breath, even on breathing support. The doctors were surprised at how quickly he had improved, though. They said it was like he was a different baby than when he was first born. They said most cardiac babies didn't look like him. They were blue and lethargic and not alert. But outside of Jesse's rapid breathing, he looked completely normal, and they thought that was remarkable with his diagnosis. Jesse's first open heart surgery was when he was 40 days old. It was supposed to only be 4 hours long, but it ended up being 21.5 hours due to complications. The last 4 hours went by with no update. We really had begun to prepare ourselves for the worst when we finally got the news that surgery was over and Jesse was in recovery. His chest had to remain open for 5 days due to swelling. Attempts to extubate him in the next several weeks continued to result in collapsed lungs. They eventually found out that his diaphragm was paralyzed from his open heart surgery, and they had to do another surgery to tack his diaphragm to his chest wall. He was on a pacemaker. They put him on dialysis for weeks because his kidneys had went dormant during surgery. He had trouble releasing inflammation. He battled infections and pneumonia. His legs and arms and veins were taken over by wires and tubes that when he needed a PICC line, his only available option was his jugular. He had numerous blood transfusions, medications, and antibiotics. One day I walked in, and the feeling of death was overpowering. I looked for hope in the nurse's eyes, but she didn't make eye contact. I got on my tiptoes and leaned my face against his head, and I prayed. I prayed that the Lord would breathe life back into his body. There were steps forward and backwards, but slowly he made progress to where he was extubated. Because of the highly addictive pain medications like fentanyl they had him on since he was born, he had to battle withdrawals. That led to extreme fits that were difficult to watch. The pictures of me holding him looked sweet, but with all the wires, it took a lot of work for the nurses to move him, and he didn't seem to like being held much or for long. All the monitors would be going off. He had gotten used to lying in the bed and comforting himself. My presence couldn't soothe him like I was used to with my other babies. I would walk back and forth between the Ronald McDonald House and Texas Children's Hospital every day, listening to worship music and praying. I could feel the fire of it all burning away what I thought I was entitled to. I was on a journey of surrendering the picture I had in my mind for our family. We naturally desire the easy, but my will was being bent to not want less than what God had for me, no matter what that looked like. I was stretching myself to see that perhaps an easy pregnancy and a healthy baby would have been a lesser gift than what God was now giving us. We were in the ICU for 116 days. It was a long journey of weaning medication and breathing support, physical therapy and feeding therapy. He had developed an oral aversion from all the tubes in his nose and throat that they suggested surgically place in a feeding port so we could get home. Going home was more difficult than I ever would have imagined. With his underdeveloped airways, the slightest cold made breathing really difficult. He had to be held sitting up on the couch for him to get any sleep. The sleepless nights really started to take a toll on me mentally. We had countless doctor appointments and in-home feeding and physical therapy for years. We were told that the first 2 years of a heart patient's life are the most critical, and we had to do everything we could to keep him healthy. So outside of doctor appointments, me and my children never left the house for 2 years. But despite our best efforts, Jesse still continued to get sick often, and we were still in and out of the hospital and even back on breathing support. Honestly, it's been rough. There are complications, adjustments, and trials that a family goes through when they suffer trauma. There was a lot lost in Jesse's infancy that can't be regained. There are challenges we still face today as a result, but God is restoring. I have faith that God will redeem it all and use it for good. Jesse does not have DeGeorge syndrome. He does not have Down syndrome, and he does not have the need for continual breathing support. As I record this, Jesse is a happy, active 5-year-old boy. You would never know his past upon meeting him. I believe his heart diagnosis is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. So much good came from this that I wouldn't change it if we could. Life is so short, and this isn't our home. We think we're entitled to so much. We grow up with a picture of life in our minds, and suffering isn't a part of it. And then when it happens, we get angry and we question God. But perhaps true spiritual maturity doesn't come from the easy. And maybe one day we'll most be grateful for the things that were difficult. We will all face trials. Even if we have a comparatively healthy heart, the hard truth is one day we will all face death. We don't have to do it alone. Jesse Josiah means gift the Lord has healed. And through the cross of Christ, we can receive not just physical healing, but spiritual healing. And without that, none of us will see the Lord. Jesse proclaims his saving power with his every breath. And I have full faith God is going to use him in mighty ways.